to high-income country, fastly developing over the last couple of years, and therefore the resilience of the population, the resilience and capacity of the infrastructure is much more developed than in other countries, and therefore people can also better resist. But there is no question that we need to scale, to speed, to adapt, and considerably to turn on the volume of humanitarian assistance in the country. With regard to violations of international humanitarian law, there is no difference whether a member is a member of the Security Council, a permanent member of the Security Council or not. 196 countries are parties to the Geneva Conventions, and ICRC engages with those parties to the Geneva Conventions on the respect of these conventions in confidential dialogue. And if we have objections or concerns with regard to the respect of those norms, we engage with those parties, as I said, in diplomatic confidential dialogue. We have been over the last 3 weeks in constant contact with the Ukrainian government and with the Russian government. We have open channels and good cooperation from both governments, which doesn't mean, as your question suggests, that we don't have problems, but we have open channels of communication to discuss the critical issues of respect, of access, of evacuations, of protection, which I have mentioned in my introduction.
Thank you for that. Ben, Alexandra, and Nick, I'm going to ask you to one at a time unmute yourself. Ben will be first, and we'll ask President Maurer to write down the questions just to save us a little bit of time. Ben, unmute yourself, please, and go ahead with what your question is, and then Alexandra. Nick, you're unmuted, so Nick, ask your question, please.
Oh, sorry. Nick Schifrin, PBS NewsHour. Thanks very much. Can you tell us more about Mariupol? How many people have left? Do you have any updates on the theater? Whether there were any fatalities at all? And in general, just any stories that you have heard about the people who are leaving and the facilitation the ICRC is doing for people to evacuate the city. Thank you.
And Alexandra, go ahead and ask your question and have Peter write it down.
My question, I have 2 questions. I'm from Ukraine, from Kyiv, a journalist of Новое время. The first question is also about Mariupol. As I understood correctly, the mission of Red Cross left Mariupol yesterday. Does it mean that you don't plan to return the mission to the city? Why did you do this? And the second question is, from the first days and still now in official communication, you call it a conflict, not a war. Can you explain why do you use this word, not a war? Thank you.
Yeah, just to your last question, that's a terminology question. Sometimes we speak about war, which is the sort of colloquial and everyday language. Sometimes we speak about armed conflict, and armed conflict is the technical language that the Geneva Conventions use. There is no difference. This is an international armed conflict according to the Geneva Conventions, and ICRC has declared it publicly and clearly with the escalation of the fighting. With regard to Mariupol, it's very difficult to have an assessment of numbers. It's very difficult to have a full assessment of an unknown assessment by ICRC people of what has happened. We had 30, 40 staff left with their families and children in Mariupol. Our delegation has been increasingly unable to operate at all in the city, had no operational capacities anymore, and that's the reason why they choose with thousands of others to get out of Mariupol yesterday, and you have seen that many others have advanced and have followed also this exit from the city. As I mentioned during my introduction, ICRC intends to service people wherever needs emerge, and we have always said it. So withdrawing at a certain moment from combat zones like Mariupol is not a prejudice to not being back as soon as possible and not being able. We have made the necessary logistical preparations to bring humanitarian assistance into Mariupol as soon as ever we can, and together with the Ukrainian Red Cross. So in that sense, I don't want to make any premature statement, as I mentioned, on what exactly has happened around the theater, what exactly has happened around other stories which have emerged from the city.
Thank you for that. Johanna, could you unmute yourself, and then Steph, please unmute yourself afterwards and ask your question. Ben, I haven't forgotten about you. We'll try you as well. Johanna, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Johanna Roth from Zeit Online in Germany. Just to clarify regarding the situation in Mariupol, there is no staff left in the city, and there is currently no possibility to bring in any form of aid. Is that correct? And so what possibilities at the moment do you have as an organization to assess the situation in the area? Could you elaborate on this a little? Thank you.
And then we'll take a question from Steph as well. Steph, go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Chris Brown. I'm using Stephanie's account. I'm with the Canadian broadcaster CBC. I want to ask you, Peter, Russia is denying it's even hitting civilian targets when the whole world can see that they are. How do you address that?
And finally, Ben, if you could, I think you're unmuted now. Ben, please ask your question and identify your outlet.
So I'm Ben Barnier with France Télévisions. My question was about Mariupol. Can you give us a reaction or assessment to the situation after the theater attack? And can you confirm that this attack happened indeed?
Thanks. Go ahead, Peter, please.
Well, as I said, we don't have an independent assessment, and therefore I can't go into any public assessment now on what happened around this specific attack, which is, of course, a disturbing images, as we see many disturbing images over the last couple of weeks. I think this is exactly what we do. We are collecting, we do collect information, we talk to people around the country to have relevant information which allows us to have a better idea of what exactly happens in the context of urban warfare, where civilians are so heavily coming under fire. But it's premature at the present moment to do any public speculations now on it. But as I mentioned, as ICRC, we will continue to engage with all parties to the conflict, in that case, certainly with the Russian Federation as well, about our concerns that we have with regard to the images emerging. We don't have, at the present moment, in the center of Mariupol, any staff. We have them nearby, and we have made logistical preparations to go into Mariupol with assistance as soon as we have a safe way in with another team that is prepared to go in. So that's at the present moment the situation for the ICRC around Mariupol.
Thank you, Sonia. If you could unmute yourself, and then after that, Katarina.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Sonia. I'm from Ukraine, Kyiv, Ukrainska Pravda. I will ask you about the transportation of bodies. As we know, the Red Cross doesn't cooperate in the transportation, although there are such requests from the Ukrainian government. So why and what are the conditions to start this transportation?
Thank you for that. And Katerina, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, please. Okay, we'll come back to Katerina. Peter, go ahead with that. Oh, no, there she is. There she is. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. In the statement of the Red Cross, it was announced that the mission is leaving Mariupol. And you also ask Ukraine and Russia to agree on the details so that people can leave the city as quickly as possible. But definitely Russia constantly violates agreements. Many times of the humanitarian corridors that were agreed have been fired upon by Russia. And in your principles that it is said that you can act as a neutral intermediary between the warring parties. Can you help arrange for safe humanitarian corridors? And what is your role now here? And the next question is, why don't you often join humanitarian convoys in Ukraine? Thanks.
The Geneva Conventions foresees that parties to the conflict register dead bodies, identify dead bodies, have them in a humane way cared for and disposed, and eventually bring them back to their families. ICRC is to help that process. This is a process which as many other processes needs agreement from both sides on the modalities, and ICRC has always been ready to facilitate talks on those modalities and to ensure that dead bodies of soldiers from both sides can return to their respective families. We are working on this issue, and it has been an important issue for discussions in today's talks. With regard to humanitarian corridors, it's first and foremost the obligations of the parties to conflict, those who control territory and roads and accesses and populations, to ensure that international humanitarian law is respected, that the population is serviced. This is the obligations of the parties. The parties need to agree on the exact road. ICRC has no military capacity to impose anything. We are here to facilitate those talks. I have ensured the Ukrainian government, as well as I ensured the Russian government, of ICRC's ability to work as an expert and to draw on the experience of ICRC in other conflicts in order to facilitate these discussions, but they have to be found in details. The compromise has to be found in details between the militaries on the ground. This is the role we have always had, and I have clarified today that ICRC is ready to play a proactive role of bringing our expertise to the table, but the responsibility for the agreement lies with the parties.
We need to keep moving quickly through these questions. We won't accept any more after Rafi. Rafi, I can't guarantee you we're going to have enough time. For now, Jamie and Fernando. Jamie, first, can you unmute yourself and please ask your question?
Hi, thank you. It's Jamie from Associated Press. Thank you. So nice to see you again, Mr. Maurer. My question really, I know everybody's been talking about Mariupol, and unfortunately I need to ask about that as well. If I understand it correctly, you had a meeting with the defense minister, Ukrainian defense minister. After that meeting, and after the convoys that we've seen from Sumy and from Mariupol, how confident are you that access to Mariupol will return in the next few days? And specifically, what are the holdups? Like, and I don't suspect you will point fingers at one or both sides, but what are the holdups in getting that access to Mariupol? And if I could just throw in very quickly, do you have any estimates as to how many people remain in Mariupol and how many got out yesterday?
Thanks for that, Jamie. Fernando, could you also ask your question, please? Fernanda, quickly unmute yourself and ask. Okay, Peter, go ahead.
Well, again, I cannot, given the pretty chaotic circumstances around Mariupol, but also even on other cities, have adequate figures which allow us to be confident on what exactly the proportions of those leaving to those staying at the present moment are. We will have to have these assessment as we move forward. So I can't share figures on that. What are the holdups? The holdups, first and foremost, is the lack of trust between parties to the conflict, is the military posture on the ground, is roads which are contaminated, weapons contaminated, therefore unsafe, and which need to be cleared before consensual exit roads are agreed upon. I don't speculate what is happening because in the next few days, because a lot will depend on whether talks lead to either temporary and partial ceasefires, which would of course facilitate humanitarian work, or whether we will see an intensification of warfare again. We need to adapt to those situations. I'm sorry, I can't share more on that specific issue.
Fernanda, could you try to unmute yourself now and ask your question? And then Agnes, if you could be ready to ask your question. Fernanda. Fernanda, we're just not able to hear you. Agnes, can you go ahead, please?
Yes, hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. A question on the evacuations of civilians. We have seen that the corridors, as we have seen in Syria, are sometimes instrumentalized by the parties. And when those who don't leave are considered terrorists. So how do you assess that issue in Ukraine? Are you afraid that about that perspective could happen? Thank you.
Well, I'm a little bit more confident that once parties agreed and they made progress on some of the talks and corridors, that we will have a better situation in Ukraine than in other contexts. As you have seen over the last couple of days, in some of the contexts where negotiations took place on evacuations, it was agreed that civilians would have the choice at a certain moment in which direction to leave, and this is a very positive development compared to some other contexts where we had one street and one-way streets to certain places, which of course were instrumentalized. I may not have responded to one question, which is the one on why ICRC doesn't accompany all the corridors. We have a serious issue, of course, of capacity, but we do the best we can whenever it is agreeable by the parties and they think that ICRC's or the Ukrainian Red Cross presence is a value added to the trust building and to the security of an evacuation. We are happy to accompany these convoys, but we can't be in all the convoys or exit routes which eventually are formally or informally taking place at the present moment.
And I'd like to apologize to everyone with their hands up. We're going to have to wrap this up really soon. We're just going to take two more questions. So Days and Adriana, if you could unmute yourself. These will be the last two questions. If I can get you to unmute yourself and ask Days and Adriana.
My name is Thais Guimarães. I'm from O Globo newspaper in Brazil. So thank you, Peter. My question is, in humanitarian terms, how big is this crisis in Ukraine? Is it comparable to another recent conflict?
And Adriana, sorry, Peter, this will be the last question. Adriana, if you're able to unmute yourself, could you ask your question, please? And she's not able to. So Peter, I think we just go ahead.
Well, look, Thais, we never compare seriousness of crises because there are 100 factors which make the seriousness of a crisis. You know that in terms of displacement, this is one of the biggest in the continent of Europe that we have seen, and certainly even worldwide. In terms of internal displacement and refugee displacement. In terms of destructions, it's very serious, as we have seen. In terms of humanitarian needs, it's pretty serious as well, although, as I have mentioned before, not affecting yet the whole of the country as we speak, but there are places of relative tranquility and good functioning of infrastructure compared to those where infrastructure broke down. So we don't make an assessment, but I wanted to give you a sense that it all depends on which perspective and lens of humanitarian need you apply. This is a top priority for ICRC at the present moment. We have huge scaling efforts I have mentioned. We have efforts with regard to scale, adapt, and increase humanitarian assistance, but also in bringing people in who can work, facilitate, and contribute to the expertise of implementing humanitarian law. And we are here as neutral intermediary wherever the Geneva Convention allows us to do so, and parties agree upon certain issues. I have mentioned them, from exchanges of detainees to access to besieged or difficult to reach areas and evacuations.
I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us. I'd like to thank you for your attention and for your questions. I thank you for Peter for your time and your observations. I apologize to those of you who have your hands up and we just simply ran out of time and didn't get a chance to hear from you. A reminder that we'll have video out on our website, www.icrcnewsroom.org. Please check back there. And again, we're sending out Peter's remarks that he's opened with to help you with that writing and reporting. Thanks again very much. Reach out to our media team anytime you have questions, and thanks, Peter.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone.